Hello everyone and welcome to Network Playroom. This is the 5th video in the Christmas calendar series, and today we're going to talk about default routes. I've mentioned default routing in my previous videos when we've discussed static routing. I've said that the default route is essentially the ultimate summary route, and default routes are used to forward packets to networks not explicitly listed in the routing table. In other words, it's a quote-unquote catch-all route to destinations that don't have a more specific route in the routing table. And for this reason, the default route is also called the gateway of last resort, which is just a fancy way of saying it. Okay, so it kind of sounds like I'm belittling default routes, but I actually love default routes. Default routes are great. Default routes are invaluable in networks where learning all the more specific routes is not desirable, as in the case of stub networks, or not feasible due to limited system resources such as memory and processing power. And default routes can drastically reduce the size of the routing table, which also makes my job as a network engineer easier, which is why I love default routes. Default routes are the real MVPs. Okay, I got a little carried away there. So let's move on. And there are 3 ways to configure a default route or the gateway of last resort. And let me write them down on the screen here. So number 1 is IP default gateway. And then number 2 is IP default network. IP default network. And then number 3, IP route 0.0.0.0, 0.0.0.0. I'm just gonna call it 0/0 from now on to bear myself from saying that string of 8 zeros. But let's get started. Let's look at the first and easiest one, which is the IP default gateway command. The IP default gateway command differs from the other 2 commands. It should only be used when IP routing is disabled on the router. And you would use this command if the router is acting as a host. So not very often, because that completely defeats the purpose of a router. In fact, I've never seen this command on a router in production. A router with IP routing disabled is not routing packets, which is the purpose of a router. So is it even a router then, if it's not routing packets? Okay, wow. That was deeply philosophical, but anyways, the point is that this command works exactly like the default gateway on your computer. So if the router is acting as a layer 2 device, you would use this command. Okay, so now let's move on to the second command, which is the IP default network command, and it's probably the most confusing one out of the 3. So unlike the IP default gateway command, the IP default network command is used when IP routing is enabled. And when you configure IP default network, the router considers routes to that network for installation as the gateway of last resort on the router. For every network configured with the IP default network command, if a router has a route to that network, that route is flagged as a candidate default route. Now that may have sounded confusing, but hopefully it'll make more sense in a moment when we look at an example. But actually, before we do that, let me clear out this information because it's gonna get crowded in here after I open all these hidden layers. Okay, so let's look at an example, and the diagram and a lot of the content on this video is from a Cisco document called Configuring a Gateway of Last Resort Using IP Commands. I'll leave a link in the description so you can go through it for more information after the video. But let's start with this information. So here is the routing table for the 2513 router over here. So as you can see, we're viewing the routing table. And there are two things to note here, and they are the static route 198.10.1.0/24 and that the gateway of last resort is not set. So we're interested in this line and then this line. So the default gateway or the gateway of last resort is not set. So watch what happens if you configure the IP default network 198.10.1.0. And we should be able to see it here. So this does not show the command that was configured, but you can see from the output that some things have changed. For example, here you can see an asterisk next to the static route and the status code. And if you look at the information here, what it means is that it is now flagged as a candidate default route, and you can see that the gateway of last resort is set. So the command to do this would have been IP default network and then 198.10.1.0. So that would produce this output right here. All right. So, another thing to point out that you can see the next hop on this static route is now the one where packets would be sent if they don't have a more specific route or more specific match in the routing table. So before the default network command was configured, the router would have discarded the packets it could not forward. So in case there was a packet with the destination, let's say to the Google DNS address 8.8.8.8. So in this case, when there is a candidate default route, the packets would be forwarded to this address. Well, it's going to be hard to point it out. This one. But in this case, since the gateway of last resort is not set, the packets would be dropped. And you can add other candidate default routes by configuring more instances of IP default network command. So this allows you to configure robustness into the selection of a gateway of last resort. Rather than configuring static routes to specific next hops, you can have the router choose a default route to a particular network by checking in the routing table. And if you lose the route to a particular network, the router selects the other candidate default. And an important thing to know about the IP default network command is that it is classful. If you configure a classless network as the IP default network, the network is not flagged as a default network. And let's look at that in this other example. So first, let me get rid of these again to make space for the other captures. So let me hide these and let's open this one. So here you can see in these lines that there was an IP route added And then that network was configured as the IP default network on this line of code. But if you look at the show IP route output, so here, this line. So if you notice, the little asterisk is missing, as you can see it here on this other candidate default route. So that means that this route did not get flagged as a candidate default. To make this work, the IP default network command must be issued again using the major network in order to flag the candidate default route. And that is done over here. So now you can see on this line that the IP default network command was changed. And this is now a major network, a class B network 171.70.0.0. And as you can see from this output, it is now flagged as a candidate default route. And notice here that it has actually replaced the previous one that we had over here. And I will explain why in a moment. So if you configure multiple networks as candidate default routes using the IP default network command, the network that has the lowest administrative distance is chosen as the network for the gateway of last resort. But if all networks have the same administrative distance, then the network listed first in the routing table is chosen as the network for the gateway of last resort. And this is why 171.70.0.0 has replaced the 198.10.1.0 as the gateway of last resort. So because this network is listed before this one, it is now the new gateway of last resort. Okay, then finally let's go over the IP route command. And as with the IP default network command, IP routing must be enabled on the router for this to work. And by the way, how do you enable IP routing? Well, it's simple. You configure IP routing in global configuration mode. So you would do router, and then in config mode, IP routing. And you could do, oh, I left a little bit, that wasn't enough space. I tried to be clever there because that command is used to disable IP routing. So let me do that again with more space. So no IP routing disables IP routing, and IP routing enables IP routing. Okay, back to the topic. So creating a static route to network 0.0.0.0, 0.0.0.0, or 0/0 as I was supposed to call it, is another way to set the gateway of last resort on a router. And from what I've seen, this is perhaps the most common way to generate a default route. So let's look at an example of that. And again, let me get rid of these. Let's hide these and then open up the IP route. So here on this line, you can see that the IP route 0/0 is configured, and it's pointed to the next hop IP address 170.170.3.3. And you can see it on this line. And again, it is flagged as a candidate default route. And this line states that the gateway of last resort is set. Okay, so here's something to consider as well. If you use both the IP default network and the IP route commands to configure candidate default networks, and the network used by the IP default network command is known statically, the network defined with the IP default network command takes precedence and is chosen for the gateway of last resort. But if a routing protocol is propagating the IP default network, the IP route 0/0, which has lower administrative distance, takes precedence and is chosen as the gateway of last resort. And if you use multiple IP route 0/0 commands to configure a default route, traffic is load balanced over the multiple routes. So for example, in the diagram, if this router had another IP route or two IP routes, default routes pointing in each direction, they would both be installed into the routing table and traffic would be load balanced between them. I know that in this example it doesn't make sense because these seem to be stub networks, like there's nothing connecting from here. But if we would imagine this whole thing as the internet, then that would make more sense. So maybe you would be connected to two routers from your service provider or two different service providers, and you would point the default route in both directions. So they would both be installed into the routing table. But lastly, I want to mention that the way in which routing protocols propagate the default route information varies for each protocol. But I'm going to leave that part out for now to avoid this video getting too long and complicated. There's a section in the Cisco document and you can read about it, more about it later on. I'm going to link it below so you can find the information there. But I hope you've enjoyed this video and thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.